Welcome, everybody, to day 4. It has been quite a week. I hope you've been able to join us. And if not, please go back to the recordings. They really have been some phenomenal lectures. And I'm really excited to wrap up this series on self-care. I probably should have put it at the very first day because I subconsciously put it at the end because unfortunately, that's where we tend to put self-care. But nevertheless, we got it in here and we have an amazing presenter as well. So this is Dr. Edward. Say your last name, Smink, right?
Smink, that's correct.
Okay. I'm not your friend unless I butcher your name. So consider us friends now. Edward is coming to us. This is his wheelhouse. He specifically has been in this work of compassion fatigue for many, many years. He is a wealth of information. He is a great resource in PCA, and I'm so excited to have him present on this topic. So Edward, it's all yours.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you everyone for coming. And I had a good laugh that it's at the end because most caregivers, including myself, have put self-care at the end of things. Oh, there's not time, but maybe I'll try it. Then all of a sudden we're at that breaking point, which happened to me 25 years ago. And so I come from a sense of experience. So I'm excited to be here and to share some of these insights so that you can learn how to care for yourself. So I guess the first question is, who are caregivers? And we all are. For at the heart of being human is the capacity to care, to reach out to others, and to explore the relationships we build. So we think of first responders, we think of the firefighters, we think of educators, we think of parents who care for their children, or spouses who care for each other, or adult children who care for their older parents. We're all caregivers. And I love this picture, and it just gives a little humor to what we're talking about, that we are all caregivers. And there's a tension among us. The tension is to deal with caring for others and at the same time caring for ourselves. And I call that the dance of caregiving. And you may just think of your own self when you say, well, maybe I'll go to the gym. Oh, but I don't have time. Or maybe I'll see that other patient, but I wish I could go home to my family. All these things happen. And it's important for us to recognize that self-care is the opportunity to take moments. They could be short moments for our time, and then we just create the time. We create the time to recall, discover, and renew our individual call to become a caregiver. That's why I call it, we get in touch with our soul, and I'll explain that later. And so when we have a crisis, and you may have heard this before, it's like the Chinese symbol of a tree in a box. And there's a part of us that digs deep down into ourself. And if you put your feet flat on the ground and wiggle your toes, those are the roots. You're trying to ground yourself. And when we're in this sort of crisis, we're trying to ground ourselves. At the same time, like the branches of a tree, we reach out, and we reach out for help. But I bet I can ask all of you, most of us are reluctant to ask for help. And the reason we are is because of our culture. Our culture comes from the early forefathers and foremothers who said we have to be rugged individualists. We have to do everything ourselves to survive. And I'll talk more about that. And so we think we're invincible. And we think we could do everything like Superman or Superwoman, but even Superman had his own Achilles heel, and we all have our own Achilles heel. So it's something for us to think about. I love this quote from Carol Pearson, and she says, the caregiver is an essential archetype in human life. None of us would be alive if no one cared for us as a child, and life without mutual caring is joyless. And so you can see how at the core of our being to be human is that we care. And what we're trying to learn, just as we, at the drop of a dime, we reach out to help another, It's the same skills we can use to help ourselves. They're not different skills. They're the same skills that we can use to help ourselves. And so what are the strengths we rely on? I like to look at these characteristics that came to me through Pearson, Atty, and Shelley in our typical understanding of leadership, and they talk about the caregiver. So you may identify as the healer, continues from time immemorial the sacred work of being entrusted to their caring. You know, most doctors are doing sacred work, and most caregivers are doing sacred work. The danger is sometimes we think we're God, but we're not. You know, so I'm sure you've heard that growing up, you know. People attribute physicians and caregivers in a godly way, but it's because we do sacred work. We're a supporter. We lend encouraging help, guidance, and counsel to others. We're an advocate. We stand up to others on behalf of those at a disadvantage. We bring out and foster capabilities and potential in others. We want the best for our patients. And then can you turn it around? I want the best for myself. Service provider, we provide consistent, high quality service or support. And we're an altruist. We give selflessly to make a difference for others. All those characteristics can help us just turn them around and say, gee, how can I use them for my own self-care? Particular strengths of a caregiver, we provide great service or counsel. We advocate for and marshal people resources. We create stable, supportive environments where people can grow, develop, and heal. And we put structures in place to help others or keep them safe from harm. And we respond to need in offering assistance. And we're servant leaders. I don't know if you know anything about servant leadership, but it simply means that you want the best for those you care for, and you give all your energies for that. So what strength is missing here? You could put it in the chat if you think of something. Of course, I can't see the chat.
I put in self-care. Chrissy put in resiliency. Anybody else have? And you can unmute too, guys. You don't have to just type. If you want to tell us, what strength do you feel that might be missing?
Yes, everyone could interrupt any time they want with a question. But what's really missing is self-care. And that's because it's at the end of the program. And it's at the end of all our programs because we're trained that way. So we have certain gifts. We are community oriented. We have a gift of nurturance, compassion, and generosity. And we contribute to life's journey, showing care, concern, compassion for others, and helping others. When we think of our unique call, why we entered into the profession as a physician or caregiver, what led us there? And it's important that we understand that and renew that, because that's what helps us deal with compassion fatigue. So what is self-care? Well, it could be time for oneself. Aren't we always trying to find time for ourselves? Taking time off. How many times do we not take a day off or our vacations? Accepting help from another. That's the biggie, that I'm really at a point where I need help. I was talking with one of my clients, and she was taking care of her father, living in with her, who had Alzheimer's. And she said, I'm exhausted. And I said, can you ask for help for anyone? Is there anyone, family members? And she said, oh, my husband's here. And I said, have you asked him? And she said, oh, I don't trust him. It's like, hello, he's right there, and he has offered to help. So she has to let go of her control and let him help her. Have we planned a vacation or trip recently? Well, I can't remember who's now in Belize, but you did. Good for you. We like walking and hiking and camping and soulful listening to self and others, where we're really present. You know, we know when a person is present with us, and we know when they hear us. And if our story is heard, we can make a lot of decisions. And most caregivers are fearful in sharing their story because they get shamed. We could have a date night, or we can have a girls' night or a boys' night. You know, we can go to the gym, we can garden, cook, read, a night out with friends. So all these are different aspects of self-care. And we look at them, we get overwhelmed. I don't have time for this. And we go, well, can I start, when you're at the shore, you put your toes in first to feel if the water's cold. Maybe you can say, well, I'm going to give myself an hour today. And, every morning I have blocked off in my calendar, I call it sacred time. And I don't do anything until after 10 o'clock, except today, which I enjoy doing. So, but mostly I don't do anything until 10 o'clock. So I have 2 hours that I just block. It's my time. So compassion fatigue occurs because caregivers care. Now, I think this is important. It's an integral side effect of being a caregiver. And I like what Dr. Charles Figley says. There is a cost to caring. Professionals who listen to client stories of fear, pain, and suffering may feel similar pains, fears, and sufferings because they care. So it's not a mental illness. And that's the biggie that most professionals deal with. They think if I really acknowledge what I'm feeling in a particular situation, I will be branded, I can't do my job. I was talking to a physician who is on a team at a neonatal intensive care unit. And just imagine the different situations that come up there. And one of them in particular is, I don't know the percentage, but many of the miracles of the intensive care cannot save that newborn. And so he's dealing with a lot of death and dying. And I said to him, can you go to one of your peers and talk about your experiences? He said, if I go to the other physicians, they would think I'm not a good doctor. So just let that sink in. That's what we're dealing with. And I like to change that paradigm. I like to change it, instead of isolating someone who has an experience, a traumatic experience, that the team itself becomes a source of healing, that group becomes a source where they can collaborate with what's going on. And I'll explain that more. So I love this cartoon. I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. There's the elephant in the room. The fact that we don't take care of ourselves. And how do you eat an elephant? Anyone?
I love this. One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. How do we deal with self-care?
One thing at a time.
One step at a time.
One step at a time.
One step at a time. Great. So what is compassion fatigue? It's a state of exhaustion related to the compassion overload. It's a normal component of caregiving. It's not a mental illness. In fact, compassion comes from two Latin words, cum, which means together, and passio, which means to suffer with. And I know as caregivers, we suffer with the patients we care for. It's just part of being human. We want the best for them, and sometimes they acknowledge that. And if their condition worsens, we're with them, we walk with them, and we still feel that sense of suffering with them. And here's some different quotes from different spiritual traditions. If your compassion does not include yourself, it's incomplete. That's a biggie. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, from the Jewish scriptures in Leviticus. And the Christian, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. And there's an Islamic saying, no one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. We grew up in a culture that we feel guilty when we acknowledge our own gifts. It should be the opposite. We should celebrate them. But that's what we grew up with. So I'm going to ask you, do you feel exhausted? You could all answer if you want.
Yes.
Most of us do feel exhausted because we feel like we're a juggler balancing things back and forth. So if you ask a caregiver, how are they? They often say, fine. And I don't know if you've heard this before. F is for fearful, or you can say effed up. I is for insecure. N is for needy. And E is for emotional. So at the bottom line, most caregivers feel a sense of fear. They're insecure, they're needy, and they're emotional. But we won't tell anybody about that. And compounding this exhaustion is the stress and anxiety of the pandemic. There's a universal woundedness we're all experiencing. There's a universal sense of compassion fatigue. We're exhausted over the pandemic. Our way of normal has been radically changed. Even if we get back to what we thought is normal, the year and a half that we experienced this has changed us. And so our normal is even different than what we think it would be. So exhaustion is normal, extended exhaustion is dangerous. So I like this sense that compassion fatigue occurs because we care. And so the root of our exhaustion can lead to compassion fatigue, which has two children. One is burnout and one is secondary stress disorder or trauma. And one could lead right into the other. 25 years ago, I suffered from compassion fatigue, and I asked the counselor that I was seeing, I said, where am I on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst? And he said, Edward, you're between 8 and 9. And I consider 10 irreversible. Just imagine. Something in me said, you better get your act together. I was like that addict lying on the street. I was a workaholic. And I was like trying to get the last drop out of the whiskey bottle. I mean, I wasn't drinking, but those were images, metaphors I had of being at rock bottom. I had to do something. And I want to say this now, getting a life coach saved my life. I can't say that clearer. My life was saved because of Leo and us working together to deal with what was happening to me. If that didn't happen, I think I would be in a loony bin at the present time. Excuse me for disqualifying that, but I would have been put away. So there are some different thoughts about compassion fatigue, and burnout. Burnout is a common term used all the time today. And it's like, hello, what does it mean? And are we actually experiencing it? So the real difference is that if we experience compassion fatigue, it's because of the nature of the work and the overuse of our compassion skills. We really love the work. We don't want to leave the work. It's just that we're exhausted, and we need to recognize that we need some help, and there's faster recovery if recognized and managed early. Burnout is more stable in onset. Oops, excuse me. It's cumulative, gradual process marked by exhaustion and withdrawal, and it becomes a frustration. It's associated with the stress of workload and institution. It's more about the institution, not the nature of the work. And we know there's an institution of medicine. We know there's an institution of healthcare, and we're all trying to do our part to radically change it, which is slowly happening. There's a story I like to talk about. When Mother Teresa was in Calcutta, the Hindu leaders came to her and said, "What can you do? You know, what can you do? Look at all this that's going on. How can you affect change?" And she said, "One person at a time." And look what happened. When her work was extolled and became further known, those same religious leaders started to thank her for how she changed that attitude of the less fortunate in Calcutta. So if we ever think we can't do enough, or who am I to do anything, you can think of her and say, I could do as much as I can do. So here's a question I have. Why are caregivers most resistant to self-care? Anyone have an answer?
For me, I think it's because of like as I grew up through the medical system, it's just like that's just not how we do things. Almost, if I was gonna name it, like almost shaming and guilt. Like,
Yes.
this is how you're gonna show you. This is how you have to show up to be a quote unquote good doctor. We have a few comments. Let me read them to you, Edward. One person says guilt too. Good. We're on the same page. Chrissy says it's not our comfort zone. Yashoda says feeling that putting ourselves first is wrong. Christy says easier to be the resource than need the resource, a double standard in self-care is selfish.
Those are very good reasons, and they have to do, I'm going to talk about 3 cultural taboos that speak to that. But compassion fatigue is like being in a prison. And caregivers often paint the bars of their jail cell gold while they hold the key, it should be, the key to their freedom in their hands. And so is it time to get your get out of jail card? What caregivers often feel is that the pain they're experiencing in being in prison is less than the pain of opening the jail door. Actually, there's more pain in staying in the prison than opening the door and reaching out for help. So here it is, invincible. We must overcome taboos to achieve compassion resilience. Again, resilience is that ability to look at something, be engaged, but then pull out of it. So the first one is, don't trust yourself or others. Sound familiar? And it has to do with trusting your peers to talk about your experiences. As Aaron just said, you know, I feel guilty if I talk, or I feel shameful. or I'll be ridiculed and shamed. I mean, I was ridiculed and shamed because with the group I was working with, I said, stop. And they said, you know, you got to keep going. And finally I left, but it took 3 years for me to open the jail door. And I go, why did it take so long? Because I was fearful, and I was ridiculed and shamed for saying I need a rest. The second is that we don't talk about our experience. So the first is we don't trust what's going on within ourselves, because it's dangerous. When we do self-reflection, it leads us to places we may not want to go. On the other hand, when we get to those places, we're able to look at them. There's an article I used several years ago that, you know, can we hold what seems not to be held? Are we able to hold it? And the answer is yes, but we're fearful that we can do that. I don't know if you saw the movie Children of a Lesser God. And in that, you know, the teacher falls in love with the custodian who is deaf. And he's trying to teach her how to read lips, which she refuses to do. So eventually she runs off and runs back to her mother, and she's angry as heck. My mother used to say, when she gets angry, she could chew nails. Anyway, that's how angry she was. And he finally finds her, and she was angry in how she was treated by her father, who rejected her because she was deaf. And so he asked her, why did you leave? And she said, I thought if I got in touch with those feelings, it would kill me. But it didn't. It didn't. So there's another myth to overcome. So the second taboo, which is also the link to be able to build resistance, is we're taught not to talk about our experiences because we don't trust. And if we have a story to tell, we want to share it. And that's why I like this organization, because they're open to sharing the story. And when you share the story, something happens because you know you're heard. You may think of, how many times have I felt I was really heard? And that's the key. When we don't want advice, we want to be heard. And so when we know we're heard, we're able to then make appropriate decisions. And the third is, don't feel what you're experiencing. And what happens, we become a ticking time bomb. Have we not been taught in our education to leave our feelings outside the door? But we're human, aren't we? And I know you can talk about powerful experiences you had when you shared your experiences with the patient or client, and in self-disclosure that was appropriate, and you found each other. The healing occurred because you created the space to listen to them, and they then became an agent for your own healing. Something to think about. So we don't trust ourselves. And it's like we're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so admitting to ourselves that you can't trust those interior stirrings of your soul, Michael Koenig refers to these promptings as soul pain. Soul pain points us inward and downward to the roots of our humanity and suggests that reconnection with our soul is the central issue. Now, in my book, I talk about soul, and I talk about it as the life-giving principle. You could talk about conscience, you could talk about, your inner self, whatever you want to talk about. It really doesn't have anything to do with religion. It has everything to do with that inner core of your being. and I like to use soul. And so you don't trust others, and not trusting your teammates, family, or friends. And you know, what happens is we become isolated. We don't want to be a burden to our teammates, friends, or family, and yet, guess what? We already are by our isolation. We pull away. You may feel that they can't handle your experiences. Your assumptions are misleading. It's not about them, but about your lack of trust. Sharing with someone that you know will listen can help you move from isolation to trust, and that's the key to self-care. If you have any thoughts or questions on trust, put them in the chat, or you can speak openly.
I was just putting a link in about your book so everybody can check it out. Soul of Caregiving. It's more of the work that you're talking about here. So I wanted to make sure we put that reference there. But I think you're absolutely right, Edward, about the trusting ourselves almost feels like a deeper level than learning to trust others. And I think that's been the hardest connection for me personally, is one, recognizing that I'm a flawed human being. And even though I will daily make mistakes, I can still trust myself.
And using that term flawed, where does that come from?
Being a recovering perfectionist. that perfection is not the goal. It's not attainable. It's absolutely fine to be a hot mess in pearls. That's where flawed doesn't have a negative connotation for me. It's just reminding that, like, it's okay that I'm a little bumped up around the edges. Doesn't mean there's anything wrong.
That's true. And I would use the term that we're human, because being human, and that's the difference between being invincible. Being human is we have boundaries. Being human is we don't know everything. I mean, in your profession, you know, you're constantly reviewing things. So it realizes that you don't know everything. And the best caregiver and physician is saying, you know, let me check that out with one of my peers. Instead of saying, oh, well, you know, giving a story. But well, I reacted, you know, to the sense of flawed because that comes from our culture of being not good enough. And so then we run into the sense of when we celebrate our gifts, we feel guilty. We think it's pride. Now, if I ask all of you, do you think you're a good physician? What would your answer be? Dun 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 dun.
Definitely.
Of course. Was that hard to say, Chrissy?
It is not.
Okay. Anyone else can say that?
Yashoda put in the comments, I know I am ... now, wasn't sure before.
Well, there's a growth. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
I remember as a nursing student, some of the mistakes I made, and I go, hey. And then afterwards I said, you know, I'm a really good nurse. Or the same as being in pastoral care, I'm a really good chaplain. Or being an executive in healthcare, I said, you know, what I'm doing is really good. I had to teach an administrator what my job was. He had no clue. Anyway, so again, when we just acknowledge and just have a sense of feeling we're okay, it's very liberating. And there's days when we feel we're not, and that's when we have to rely on the fact that yesterday we felt we were. The second is we don't talk about our experiences. And here's what's important. We have normal experiences to abnormal traumatic situations. So I'm thinking, you've heard of those presently now, the fires going on in Northern California, but last year, the town of Paradise that burned completely down. And just think of the first responders that went back there. You know, they had normal experiences to that tragedy, but was there any way to debrief? I was talking to an emergency medical personnel, EMS, and she was at a plane crash, and they could not save the pilot. And she started drinking heavily, and finally her supervisor said to her, "You have to go to the debriefing session." It was voluntary. So she went, and she realized, you know, that what she was experiencing was normal. I mean, I don't know how I would experience looking at a plane crash and seeing someone die. I mean, I've dealt with people dying in the hospital, but not first responders. And she found that it really helped her. And I was able to coach her. And then finally, she became an advocate for doing this type of debriefing. And the members of her team called this the Crybabies Club.
Mm.
Now, you probably have heard that too.
Yeah. Edward, don't you feel like sometimes in your coaching, or at least from my experience, sometimes there is a period where the client is almost debriefing with you? They almost need to recant that experience.
Exactly.
To debrief it off.
Exactly. And that means that what I have learned, and I'll talk about this, what I've learned is, how do you listen? So I remember taking this course, and the professor said, there's 3 rules to a good listener. The first is to listen. And then she said, the second is to listen. Guess what the third is?
To listen.
To listen. And so that's something that we learn to do. So anyway.
You know, one thing I tell my children, I'm like, are you listening to me or did you hear me?
That's good. Yeah, okay. And then you know you're heard. And most of us don't want advice. And what you just said, Erin, we want someone to listen to us and to be heard. We need to talk to someone whom we can trust. Talking to another is believing they will listen. They will listening. So again, trusting someone so you can be heard, again, is another step to self-care. It could be a spouse, it could be a good friend, it could be a pastor, it could be anyone you know that you say, do you have a minute? I really want you to listen. And you could say to them, don't say anything until I tell my story. Because most of us interrupt all the time. And here you go. So the U.S. State Department has this course on how to actively listen. And they say to listen, you must use both ears. And so they have different colors for this Chinese symbol. Watch and maintain eye contact. Give undivided attention. Be empathetic. Seek to understand before you seek to be understood. Be non-judgmental, and I know that's hard at times. Give the individual and yourself your undivided attention and use silence effectively. So they have different colors for this symbol. And and the US State Department uses this in their teaching their diplomats how to listen. And the last one is you don't feel what you're experiencing. Don't share your feelings versus share your joys, hopes, and difficulties and sufferings. So feelings are dangerous. Stiff upper lip, big boys don't cry, and girls are too emotional. Didn't we all learn that? Leave your emotions at home or at the door and stuff your feeling. What happens is you become a walking time bomb. So I'm just go through this quickly, some symptoms, and I always say I have these every day. If they're physical, they're emotional, and they're spiritual, and they're somatic complaints, weight loss or gain, distress, and you could read through them later. Emotional instability, sarcasm, racing thoughts, and spiritual loss of meaning and happiness because we've become caretakers instead of caregivers. Can you hear the difference? Oh, I hate going to work, caretaker. I love going to work, but I'm exhausted, caregiver. And so self-care is often easier than we think. It's the antidote for compassion fatigue and building compassion resilience. So I love this cartoon. I feel nervous and uneasy. Any doctor will tell you that if you are tense or distraught, there is one sure way to feel better. Simply lie with your head in your water dish. This is hushed up, of course, because it would be completely ruin the drug companies. So very simply, compassion resilience is the ability to recognize there's an issue, to seek someone you can trust, and to make appropriate decisions. I like to just say I'm open for questions. And here's my book. If you're interested in a signed copy, go to my website and I will send you one. If you're interested in buying it on Amazon, you can buy it on Amazon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the recording, and then that way we can have some safe space to talk.
Wonderful.